This collection comprises 13 shows drawn from the 50 or so that I've written and performed in over almost 2 decades. The most recent was shot in 2007, the earliest in 1989. That was 4 prime ministers ago. Times change. Technologies develop, wastes expand and contract, British hotels improve a bit. But certain things do remain the same. Writing is always difficult. Filming, whether on celluloid or tape, is always in equal measures exasperation and enjoyment. My intentions, too, are unvarying. To cast light on what is occluded and forgotten and, sometimes literally, unmapped. And also to draw attention to what's under our noses, the everyday stuff that is so familiar that it's ignored or held in contempt. Everywhere is interesting if you shed your preconceptions. Everywhere promotes ideas and dreams. Obviously, there are countless approaches I could have taken towards the subjects of these shows, many of which were hardly acknowledged as subjects. I knew what I didn't want. I didn't want the portentousness and worthiness which, to this day, contaminates so much telly that is deemed serious but is actually frivolity in a solemn cloak. I didn't want the frantic arm-waving of the repertorial cliché-monger. I didn't want the excitable breathiness of the inarticulate buff. I didn't want the sententious drooling of the man who rarely cares. What I did want was just about everything else. I wanted maximalism, for the shows to be witty and knockabout, polemical and melancholy, neophiliac and nostalgic, visually elaborate and verbally complex by telly standards, that is. I wanted them to belong to the lecture hall and the music hall, to be instructive and entertaining. Most of all, I wanted them to be artifices, patently staged performances which invented their own almost hermetic actuality. The process hardly varies. A recce with or without the director, either way it shouldn't be protracted, because acquaintance dulls imagination. Then I write a script, a detailed and prescriptive document which forces the director to work within constraints which are catalysts rather than inhibitors of the imagination. Once I've done that, I become a sort of hired hand, a turn who takes direction and speaks what might as well be someone else's script. Any collaborative enterprise involves trust. I've been fortunate to work with a slowly mutating group of like-minded people who appreciate that the only rule worth observing is don't bore. David Turnbull and Russell England directed nearly everything I did in the 90s, Frank Hanley, Tim Neal and Colin Murray in this decade. The director of photography, Robert Payton, has worked on 20 of my shows. Alan Campbell and Martha Wales have been keeping the quasi-military operation on the road for years. The creature who shares my name and wanders through these largely imaginary landscapes is as much their invention as he is mine, so I alone am not to blame. The earliest of the pieces here is Seven Heaven. It explores a plotland site beside that river and the Severn Valley Railway just north of Bewdley in Worcestershire. Plotlands were unofficial, often squatted settlements, mostly built between the 2 world wars from improvised materials, old railway stock and sleepers, abundant asbestos sheeting and so on. Armed forces veterans from the First World War could get grants to establish small holdings. W.H. Colt, a Kent firm which manufactured chicken coops, discovered that smallholders were living in these coops, and they went on to design ampler timber buildings. There were plotlands all over Britain. They were despised as instant slums by planning authorities who often applied legislation retrospectively and illegally to tear them down. Further, the land the dwellings were built on was, by the 1980s, much more valuable than the structures themselves. It was evident by then that they were disappearing, which is why I wanted to record what was the largest survivor. The New Forest's western and northern fringes were home to a number of scrappy plotland developments, one of them at a place called Bohemia. There are astonishingly 4 places in Britain called Bohemia. This was worth investigating. In Search of Bohemia was the result. Even more astonishingly, 2 of the British Bohemias, the one in the Forest and another in Hastings, have tenuous connections to artistic Bohemia, the artistic Bohemia of such painters as Augustus John, who lived on the edge of the forest at Fordingbridge. 2 of his studios show how much domestic design would take from this type of building. And Hastings was for a while a thriving artists' colony, an unacknowledged St. Ives. The red larder that's a tip on wheels was my own. Much of a novel I wrote in the early 90s was set in Belgium. I had, at the time, not been there, deliberately. I didn't want the actuality getting in the way of my invention. When I did go there, it proved to be so endearingly strange, so routinely bizarre, so extravagantly comic, that the show that we did, broadly entitled Belgium, proposes that René Magritte, far from being a surrealist, was simply a reportorial observer of his compatriots' mores. What other country practices vertical archery and finch sport? Or creates terraces in which every house is different from its neighbours? Or possesses the museums of underwear and ironing? What other small nation produces 700 beers? Where else would a man achieve national acclaim for dressing as a penguin? Brussels is often reckoned to be boring. It isn't. Get out of the centre and you're rewarded with the sight of Europe's finest suburbs. I've suffered from vertigo since I was 20, when a car I was a passenger in broke down in the middle of the Pont d'Aquitaine near Bordeaux, and I foolishly gaped down at the fingernail-sized vessels on the river below. I reckoned that submitting myself to a variety of vertiginous experiences on camera would cure me of it. Surely the knowledge that I would be watched by millions would give me strength. I was wrong. If anything, making Get High merely exacerbated my condition. I remained, and still remain, irrationally terrified. I confidently thought that I'd be able to walk across Clifton Suspension Bridge. Sure enough, I crawled. Brunel turned me to jelly, and so did a boat trip across Telford's aqueduct. I have no compulsion to jump, just to cower. A ride on a roller coaster which goes over the sea was perhaps not quite as bad as I had anticipated, but I haven't been on one since, and nor have I returned to the heights of Richard Rogers' Lloyd's building, much as I admire it. The sporting cast includes Miss Wrexham and a life-size inflatable Meades doll, which has no apertures. In the secular post-war years, when congregations were diminishing, both the Roman Catholic and Anglican confessions built numerous new churches. Some, including the most famous of them, Coventry Cathedral, replaced buildings lost to bombs. Many, however, were devised in the 1960s to accommodate the liturgical demands of Vatican II. The very idea of what sort of building a church should be was called into question, which is where it got interesting. The absentee landlord suggests that architects were designing ultimately for a fictitious client, a slippery human invention. They could do what they liked. Here was a type of building that was ideally suited to the expressionistic modernism which was then so fashionable. So a free-for-all ensued, and the results were delightfully sculptural. Churches like fossils, churches like fruit machines, churches like marquees. No part of England looks so un-English as the fens of Norfolk, Cambridgeshire and Lincolnshire. Dead flat, often below sea level, drained by unerringly straight canals that rise above the black earth, they present epic landscapes, skyscapes and waterscapes, which are closer to the sublime than to the picturesque. Double Dutch wonders what this environment does to the people who live and work there in what seems like a rectilinear factory without a roof. Why should this thrilling, bleak, displaced chunk of the Netherlands be the English mecca of lowbrow American pursuits, such as stock car racing and line dancing? And why do its inhabitants, unlike those of the real Holland across the sea, make so little effort to prettify it? The white heat of the technological revolution. The high point of British architectural modernism occurred during Harold Wilson's first two administrations between 1964 and 1970. That was the age of big tech. It took a machine the size of a bungalow to do what a palm top can do today. Our surroundings were dramatically changed by transmitter masts, listening stations, radio telescopes, and audacious buildings. These monuments of that distant and better age are tracked down in Remember the Future with the help of a benometer, named in honour of Wilson's Minister of Technology, Anthony Wedgwood Benn, as he then was. 2-metre-tall burgers, Christopher Biggins sweating in a kitchen, a pig singing about its forthcoming transubstantiation into sausage. Fast food is one of a series of 3 shows about what Britain eats and what it thinks it eats, which isn't quite the same thing. It is, self-evidently, a protracted review sketch rather than yet another analysis of Britain's peculiar relationship to food. Nonetheless, it does make the point that the relentlessly mediated gastronomic revolution, fresh organic produce, farmers' markets on every corner, decent restaurants and so on, is enjoyed by a tiny fragment of the population. It is atypical of the common experience. Most Britons eat industrial grot because that's all they can afford. Father to the Man is a directly rather than obliquely autobiographical piece about how my interest in place was triggered by being driven around South Wiltshire, West Hampshire and North Dorset by my father, who was a rep for a biscuit company. The infant Meades would wander round in a spirit of untutored curiosity and amazement at everyday things. Loci include the floated meadows of the Avon Valley, Sherborne Castle, Southampton Water, sunken lanes, and B roads to nowhere, and Mudderford, home of the crab sandwich. The North begins where grain spirit and beer replace wine as the staple drink because the climate is hostile to vines. That, anyway, is where I decreed it would begin in Magnetic North. We begin in French Flanders and head north, trying to define northernness, trying to locate its essential qualities. Of course, I failed to do so. But along the way, there's a lot to take in. The Gothic and the grotesque, the vitality of Hamburg and its monument to the unknown pimp, the creepiness of German woods, Polish fortresses, the Brezhnev plays Vegas style of late Soviet architecture, Tallinn's beauty, Finland's uterine nostalgia. There are many scenes in bars where the herrings were played by herrings and the gin, schnapps and vodka were played by water.